Okay, so, and now for our other featured reader, Nancy Carroll Moody. I love hearing her read her work, which is filled with wisdom and wit, exquisitely written, a rare commodity in poetry, I think, but you've heard Quinton, and so that's the same. As I said earlier, she and Quinton created the Poets Corner that gives opportunity to so many of our local poets each year, and I have wanted to get Nancy and Quinton to read together for some time now, and I was delighted when they enthusiastically accepted our invitation to do just that and come share their work here with us today. Please welcome Nancy Carroll Moody.
That's the short person. Yeah, I think that works. Can you hear me? Excellent. Stephen, thank you to you and Charles for hosting, and thank you for Barnes Noble for supporting poetry and this this second Sunday series. It's a wonderful thing, but you know, we can stand up here and read our poems and it seems to be about us, but actually it's about you, all the people here in the audience. So thank you for being here when you could have been doing any other thing on a Sunday afternoon. So it's greatly appreciated. And so this reading is for everyone here. And have a bit of a trouble following Quinton because she's a hard act to follow. And so what I have done as a sort of segue is I have built a poem, and it's a form called a cento, which is a form that takes lines from someone else's work, and they're individual lines, and they're reassembled, kind of a mashup, into a new poem. And so I have brought Quinton's poem here, and I'm also realizing I have my wrong glasses on, so pause while we switch. This poem I wrote from lines from Quinton's book, Mrs. Schrodinger's Breast, which is here on the table today. And the title of the poem is also taken from her work. Of 1,000 other things that turn up, a cento from Quinton Hallett. If there is a fresh pear on the counter, if spring blares magnolia and forsythia along the verges of night, there is no possibility of betrayal. Walk into the woods. If volume is ever to be increased or diminished, stealth is your best suit, refracting too much noise and light, invisible to everyone but you. Listen to me tap the old tunes sotto voce. To measure or contain is an insult where metal corrodes just short of bursting. It might be a bullet in the chamber, or a blank, or sometimes pendulous clouds. Yet, every condolence left beside the bridge. At first, one of anything marries the void. If there is a feral woman, forget that old myth, tough as dried fruit. You won't last an hour in open air. To name the body of water, to cover innocent shrubs before they clench, to wrap but our arms around each other. And so I began my reading with my unaided poems. And the first one I'm going to start with is a love poem. Ruby. It's a love poem to a turkey vulture. Ruby. It's true, I fell in love at the Raptor Center. Feathers slinking dark, exhaling the skank of long-dead meat, Quasimodo hunger, the brutal convolutions of her face, red as a hibiscus on fire. Do you know a vulture's stomach is a pouch of pure acid? That she defecates on herself to kill the bacteria clinging to her legs? That her baldness keeps dead flesh from sticking when she withdraws her head from the rectum of a carcass? But it's merely academic lust, this laying out of facts. It was her eye that made me fall so hard. Eye of cappuccino, eye made from chocolate melt, eye so soft and tender with her gaze, it didn't reflect my own astringency back. I have a fellow in my life, his name is Long George. And Long George inhabits a series of interlocked poems. And he's a fellow at midlife, and he's reflecting back, and he spends a lot of time reflecting back on the past, on the present, and into the future. And so while these poems as a collection can relate to one another, I hope that each one stands on its own and doesn't require the context of the others to be understood. So I brought a Long George poem today, and this one is called Long George Takes Shelter. Even back then, 3rd grade, 1961, he was too long to wedge beneath, so one leg always stuck out into the aisle between the rows of creaky-lidded school desks. George can still hear Lindy Weston snickering, and someone, Alice Potter or Kathleen Kapinski, would tug apart his shoelaces and knot them around a chair or desk leg so that when the buzzer rang the all clear and the children could return to the safety of their geography lessons, George would be all tangled up as he tried to detach from whatever it was he'd been tethered to. The first time it happened, he'd brought his desk down with him. A horrible thud and clatter, and Miss Taylor up front slapping her hands together and scolding, "Boys, boys," when really it had been the girls all along. Miss Taylor. When the bomb they were dreading finally went off, and foggy mushrooms were in bloom above every single one of the 5 Great Lakes, whose cozy acronym he dutifully memorized, and George's unsheltered leg was blown clear to Everett Avenue at least, Miss Taylor would be the one to hold him close until his father arrived, and carried George home to his sad, one-legged future. At least, for once, he would have a good excuse to cry. And George imagined how he'd bury his head in the yellow-dotted pillow that was the front of Miss Taylor's dress, and sob the sobs he'd been holding an eternity of days inside. Had her name been Elizabeth? Long George thinks it was, but what does he remember now, well beyond a half-century since? And Elizabeth Taylor, the famous one, having married at least 100 times, grown frightening and fat with her oil-black hair and violet eyes, which never lost their way of looking straight into the bones of you. Years ago, when she was still alive, George would occasionally spot her in a wheelchair on the cover of the Enquirer or the Star. He'd seen Elvis and Jack Kennedy propped in that same chair as he'd waited in Peebles' grocery line with his jar of Tang or head of iceberg. George didn't take much stock in grocery store headlines, but he could never quite shake the chill of someone making money off the way that beauty has of turning itself sad. So there they were, his Elizabeth Taylor and the movie version, forever conflated in his mind. And Long George wonders now as he sits out on his porch this May afternoon, the sky grumbling with distant thunder, the green paint of the house trim stretching thin, his arms defying gravity as they rest, weightless, on the frame of his Adirondack chair. If the act of moving forward will always be a circle that blurs right back into the past. The cars on the street could just as easily be desks. The pavement, the aisle, where George had watched Miss Taylor's stockinged legs swish up and down the classroom rows, tucking everyone in as best she could before folding herself up like an origami crane under the big oak desk, which held her at a distance from all her charges, including the girls, who, for at least the next 5 decades and likely beyond, would forever be pulling on George's strings, tying him up in a doomsday of knots. Well, it's not quite winter, but winter creeps into my poems, especially in winter and getting there. And so I have a couple of winter poems. What should I say? If any of you have lived or spent time in elevation, you know that things are strange in the mountains when things can be strange in the mountains. And for example, ice cream that's been packed at a lower elevation will rise from its carton if you take the lid off, kind of like a souffle. Or water takes forever to boil. So this poem kind of references a couple of those elements. Winter squeezes so hard in these mountains that even the ice cream won't stay in its carton. Sky a spirograph of cirrus, and switchbacks mean tire chains clattering in the wheel wells. Pine pitch flash frozen to soles of boots. Lid held firm, and still it takes forever for anything to boil. At peak of season, there comes the luxury of heated conversation, nothing being argued into thin air. How it aches to breathe, lungs so emptied, the brain gets pulled down into them. And this poem, I seem to be obsessed a little bit with driving on ice, and so this poem comes from that. Also, it references Patsy Cline, the country western singer who died in an airplane crash in 1963. Another poem about winter. The snow's a broken record on these hairpins at 28 below. Arrowed yellow signs, hieroglyph cautions the nerve-racked can't glimpse. Wiper blades swish, swish over false promises of easy sleet. Recall the salesman waving his wand over the car's black hood. Beneath, hose like a missing guardrail, fan belt crumbling like mountainside. If a key turns in the ignition and no one's there to rev the engine, can horsepower still drive you over the cliff? The clutch is holding, but what? Oh, to ride a magic carpet spun from 0G. And this prayer, may there be icing on nothing but cake. Patsy on the radio singing I Fall to Pieces, and she did. I have this small anecdote about my father, and he was in California, living in California, and he began to take care of a little volunteer seedling in his yard, and this is before certain medicinals were available and legal on the West Coast. So this poem came from that anecdote, and the poem is titled Orphan. My father watered a seedling growing wild in his yard. Just a little weed, he said. A little weed. I didn't think he knew, because a daughter has no idea of what a father knows. Every morning, day into day, he dampened the soil of his secret. He tended it with a tenderness I've never seen, gangly thing, shoving itself up improbably from the clay, scrawny, illicit foundling my father had faith he could nurture. One morning it was gone, plucked or pulled or whatever it had taken to yank it free, barely a scuff in the dirt remaining. He never questioned its absence, my father, his world made of water and dust and sudden disappearance. And because I'm a believer in equal time, I have a mother poem, although the mother poem gets a little more real estate than the father poem. And this is my poem that was in the anthology that Stephen mentioned in the introduction, the Best Indie Lit New England anthology that I share a poem with Quinton. So we were very excited to have our poems together, and this is mine that's in that anthology. And it references, when we've lost someone we love, they keep coming back to us in dreams, or we can be in the store and turn around and think we see them for a moment, and they continue to inhabit us and visit us. And so this poem goes to that. And now my mother again, the back of her boarding a bus. A snag in her blouse, no. A tear in the seam where petals of flowers pinch into themselves. She hasn't set foot in my dreams for more than 20 years. Then, that wall she stepped so easily over, as if it were a simple pasture fence. And when I ran to look, nothing but wind-carved dunes I plunged headlong into, my mouth filling with sand. Oh, mother, how is it that what remains is the grit of you sifting through my fingers? Once there was a beach, waves and salt spray, tar balls gummed to the soles of my feet, flat and black as Sunday pancakes. The sand crabs I brought home in the yellow bucket stunk up my room with their death. How you cleared out the smell with rags you shredded with your teeth, then promised me one lily to lay across the troweled grave. Scentless flower whirled like a seashell, no sound of the ocean in its ear. What was it you longed for those arid years, when my mere reach could pull you inside out? And still I cannot stare into a tide's carnival pool without seeing that starfish blessed with 6 arms, beside it another, left with only 4. Even then, a lesson in the averaging out, a limb the price of a limb. And now the back of you, boarding a bus, a woman of apparent substance inhabiting this city I do not recognize. How your hand reaches out to grasp the rail, letting it support the whole weight of you. That hole in your blouse, the one small gasp of flesh I'm allowed. And because poetry is about little if it's not about theft, many moons ago, I had a conversation with my friend Sherry, who's here today, and she was telling me about her son, who at the time was 13, and he had just the night before gone to his first school dance. And so she told this story, and then I went home and stole it and made my own version of it the next morning. And so this poem is called After the Dance, and it's for Sherry, his mother. That night he reports that he slow danced with a girl. It was okay, though she was too tall and her arms hung fisted and heavy on his shoulders, same as the ropes he mounts in gym. When the music was done, he slipped outside to shoot hoops with the boys, stone cans behind the woodshop wall. As an afterthought, he mentions he needs aftershave. He's 13. He doesn't shave. But you quickly agree with one condition, that you'll buy it for him, fearing for the nose of his 8th grade teacher, all her boys immersed now in waters of cologne. Crusty knees and mud, boy musk, bicycle grease. You'll know the scent when you find it. Something to make the girls love him, but not so much he'll leave you. And my poems are peopled with what I call my invisible friends and my imaginary friends. And so one of my companions is a mermaid. And this mermaid lives on dry ground, and she feels a little displaced quite often. Mermaid consults a master gardener. Plow your hands in, she directs, and I do, bringing to air 2 fistfuls and a writhing in the gap between. I think gill net. I think propeller blade. But I'm not one to rock the boat. I open my fingers. Black squirms and crumbles through. And something else familiar, a whiff of demise. Bone meal, she says as in prayer. Fish emulsion. I hear capitals, the names like God. I had wanted only to transplant a sapling, conjure life from a bulb or 2. By not tossing my bottles to the sea, from envy, with newness. In these ways I have been green, all of me but my thumb. And also the mermaid, chicken of the sea tuna, remember that with the can? And mermaid regards her image on a tuna can. Once upon a time, my problem was a matter of larger than life. Once, meaning not now. Time, a way of disappointing yourself. And a problem's no more than what you made of it then. Now I'm diminished to less than an inch. You tell me when I went blonde. Teeth of an anchor woman, scepter glinting in paper gold. Rainbow above water, I'm a blue-suited body in ebb to green. The yellow tail fin is where it all fans out. The sea in this can, and I, its dependable chicken. And I'm going to finish with a poem, the way I began, with a love poem. And this poem is after a block print by Robert W. Jensen, and my good fortune to Quinton for having shown me this block print, and I imagined a poem from it. And the poem is called Dandelion, and it's after a block print by Robert W. Jensen. The artist who hovered his chisel and blade above the hardwood block understood that moment between workup and carve, knew there must be lift before there is soar. See here the yet anchored tufts, starburst aftermath of the yellowed yellow bloom, daytime sparklers, an infinitude of arms in aching stasis, arcing out and arcing still, uneasy possibility in every inflection. And what of the ones already freed? No nuance defines their flight. Blunted kite tails poised to rudder, shuttle clocks fleeing the smack of racket. Open field, what they're aiming for. Or stranded nest, or pasture fence. Wind shift or instinct or sheer happenstance, it doesn't really matter how. One puff of unbidden air and they're gone. Without you, this is how I would go on. Thank you so much.
Thanks again, Nancy. Let's have another round of applause for Nancy Carroll Moody. I don't know about you guys, but this is a real treat for me, so I'm so glad they were able to be here today for us. So. All right, we're going to take a short break, about 10 minutes, and then we'll come back for our open mic. So, see you then.